Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for inviting me and hosting all of us here on beautiful Secwepemc territories in Secwepemc. And it's an honor to be here in memory of Art and to continue the good work that Art did, and especially all of the good work that Art mentored us to do. I met Art, actually it's funny that Clay talks about busing people into town. I first met Art about 20 years ago during the fight against Sun Peaks here in Secwepemc territory. And Kairos and Mayuk mentioned to some of us in the city of Vancouver whether we could bus people up to fight against the expansion of Sun Peaks Resort. And so over the span of a few months, we worked together to bring several hundred people up here into Secwepemc territories when the fight against Sun Peaks was happening. And Mayuk and Kairos forgot that they told us to bring the buses. So they weren't here when we got here, and so Janice and Henry basically ran that entire week when we came up here. And so it's an honor to be here, and to be here with Grandma Flo, and to be here with everybody from this community that has really been fighting on the front lines for, of course, since time immemorial. But really for me over the past several decades have been so influential in mine and many other people's teachings about Indigenous sovereignty, Indigenous law, Indigenous jurisdiction, and the many fights here at Secwepemc. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, some of the things that I've learned about art and thinking about it in an international context, which is what Hans had asked me to talk about ways we can link struggles that are happening in many different movements, in many different places. And one of the things that Secwepemc here in Secwepemc territory and so many other territories we see happening is just a number of blockades all across Indigenous lands, all across Scurr Island, right? Where we see Indigenous blockades on the front line of disrupting resource extraction, whether that's mining, whether that's tar sands, whether that's pipelines, whether that's biodiesel dumps, whether that's hydro. We have so many blockades all across this land that may seem like they're different and that they're targeting so many different kinds of projects, but that really are about the same fundamental issue, right? The same fundamental issue, which is the destruction of land on Indigenous territories without Indigenous consent. That companies all across these lands have absolutely no consent to operate under Indigenous laws, and that all of these companies and all of these settler governments are continuing a very long process of colonization, right? By going in and grabbing land and stealing land. And so blockades are really profound. So, the blockade that happened at Sun Peaks, all of the blockades that are happening against pipelines are so profound because not only are they disrupting business as usual, not only are we stopping economic development from happening, but also these blockades are a very profound way of saying, no, this is Indigenous land. This is Indigenous law, right? We have an absolute right to say no and assert our jurisdiction, our laws, our territory. And so one of the things that Art used to talk about and that he writes about is his theory of colonialism, which he explains as three different linked kind of processes. He talks about dispossession, the forced removal of Indigenous people from their lands by land grabbing. And he talks about impoverishment. So he talks about how Indigenous people being poor at every single indicator, whether we're looking at health or income distribution, we're looking at incarceration, if we look at health inequities, if we look at lack of access to water, this is because of a colonial system that has forced Indigenous people onto reservations, right? Onto reserves and reservations. What Art says is a 0.02% land base. That is what makes Indigenous peoples poor across the globe. It's not because people don't have resources or nations don't have resources, it's because Indigenous peoples have been forced through dispossession into smaller and smaller tracts of land. And he also talks then about dependency, the ways in which communities are being held hostage, right? So being forced to make deals, being forced to trade land for jobs, being forced to trade land for financial deals, right? So this dependency is also part of colonization. So this is something that Art told us, that these are all related, that impoverishment and dependency and dispossession are all connected. And for me, I see that deeply. My work is in the downtown east side of Vancouver for the past 15 years. And that neighborhood, as you all know, is the epicenter of forced impoverishment, of forced dependency, of colonization. We have an epidemic of violence against Indigenous women and girls and trans and two-spirit people in that neighborhood and across these lands, right? And so what Art and so many other people have taught us is also that urban struggles and land struggles are not disconnected, that these are one and the same, that what happens on the front line on the land is the same front line in any inner city that is experiencing gentrification, that is experiencing incarceration, that is experiencing violence. These are all front lines. These are all forms of Indigenous land defense. These are all forms of resistance to colonization and criminalization. And that really this is all the same bullshit terra nullius that started hundreds of years ago, right? Where colonizers thought that land was barren. The idea that if land wasn't property, that if land wasn't private property, that it could be taken, it could be extracted, and that not only were people supposedly not on the land, but that also all living things could be extracted. That land could become a commodity, trees could become a commodity, the air could be a commodity, that colonialism and capitalism work together, right? That colonization depends on capitalist extraction, and capitalist extraction depends on colonialism and white supremacy. These are completely related. And in contrast to that, the work of INET, Art's work with Indigenous Economies on network, or Indigenous Network on Economies and Trade, and the work of so many others, but just to talk a little bit about Art's work, was how Indigenous Economies is in complete contrast to colonization and capitalism. That Indigenous economies are based on land, are based on kinship, are based on reciprocity, are based on nationhood, not on extractivism, but on care. Based on 7 generations, right? So this is the work of Art, talking about Indigenous law also as a form of Indigenous economy. The interdependency between all living things. And this extraction that Art talks about here on Turtle Island is also work that he did at the international level with so many Indigenous nations and communities in his work at the UN. And we see that today. Ariel mentioned what's happening in Brazil with the mass fires and the deforestation of the Amazon. The Amazon is being deforested at a rate of 6 football fields every minute. 6 football fields every single minute. That is the rate of deforestation in Brazil. In India, Operation Green Hunt has been going on for almost a decade, where 100,000 to 250,000 Indian Army troops are invading Adivasi lands because they're basically the mining heartland of the region. There's 4,000 memorandums of understanding, MOUs, in one region. And they say they're in there to fight guerrilla warfare. That they're there to fight Adivasis, that they're there to fight Naxalites and Maoist movements, but really the Indian Army is in there to expropriate land. Land that has iron, that has copper, that's really the mining heartland of the region. In the Philippines is the #1 country for the assassination of land defenders. Hundreds and hundreds of land defenders are murdered every single year in the Philippines. And Indigenous communities, Lumad peoples on Negros Island, who are murdered for defending their land. And in all of these countries, in India, in Brazil, in the Philippines, here on Turtle Island, all of these places where we see Indigenous land defenders criminalized and assassinated, these are colonial governments, headed by colonial governments who use racism, and who are supported by capitalist corporations to extract land. This is a global phenomenon. And that's the work that Art was doing at the United Nations level. And the work that he was doing with Indigenous peoples all across the world, when he was instrumental in ensuring the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was implemented, and that there were some very core principles of self-determination and of free, prior, and informed consent that Indigenous peoples could use to affirm Indigenous rights and title all around the world, right? To see this in its international scope. And that's some of the legacy that art leaves us with that is so important. And some of the work that Art and I did was trying to connect the issue of Indigenous land defense with another crisis that's erupting all around the world, which is the migration crisis. Refugees. 6 people every single minute is also being displaced from their homes. And to me that stands out. You know, when I think about the Amazon, 6 football fields every single minute being cleared, and then 6 people every single minute also being displaced from their homes. And we see that at the southern border, right? Indigenous peoples, Mayan people, so many different people who are trying to now cross to the north and are being caged. And I know this community knows that firsthand, what the experiences of being caged at the border means. Right? So we have settler colonial governments displacing people and then also not allowing people to move and to live with any kind of dignity. I want to conclude by talking about the Red New Deal. Ktunaxa and I have been talking about this because you might have heard right now there's a lot of talk about the Green New Deal, right? Which is how do we how do we have a just transition under a Green New Deal where we have jobs and protect the environment for everybody? And our comrades down south from the Red Nation have said we need to go beyond a Green New Deal. We need to talk about a Red New Deal that at its core centers Indigenous sovereignty. That any just transition needs to center Indigenous laws and Indigenous jurisdiction. And also that this just can't be another way of managing colonialism or capitalism. It can't just be a new way, just a new name for the same bullshit, right? That a Green New Deal needs to put Indigenous sovereignty at the center, that it must end capitalism, it must end resource extraction, it must affirm free and prior and informed consent. It has to dismantle every sweatshop and every prison across these lands. Every single military machine, which is the biggest gas-guzzling industry in the entire planet, is the military. That needs to be dismantled. That these are all connected issues. And I think the work that's been happening here for generations in Secwepemc is the heart of a Red New Deal. This nation and this community has been fighting and showing us the way forward based on Secwepemc law, based on Secwepemc title for so many decades. And so I thank this community and this nation for teaching so many of us. And I want to say that we are here and we are alongside. Thank you.
So my goal is to stop speaking before Ashish gets up. So I'll try to stick to that time. So my name is Bianchi, and I'm with Kairos. It's a coalition that was formed in 2001. And I wanted to talk a bit about how its formation and its growth since then is an example, it can be an example of how we can build these national, local, regional, and national, international networks. I appreciate all the previous speakers and all their knowledge and wisdom and their experience. I also want to acknowledge again the people who organized this event and to thank them for bringing us together and for including myself in the conversation. I'm really profoundly honored by that. And I also want to acknowledge that it's largely because of ART's ongoing work and commitment to these issues and this struggle that we are all here today, and sort of like keep that in mind going forward. I appreciate Clayton emphasizing the victories, because often we forget those. And as people who have been, inundated with a lot of the challenges that Harsha so eloquently outlined here, it's very important, I think, to remind ourselves that, we do have, there are examples of when working together and working collectively actually brings about some kind of positive change. And I think we need to also emphasize the work that's being done and that is at the community level, as we've heard today here, and in Luzon territory, on Dene land, all those initiatives and efforts that collectively eventually will make a big difference. And I think we need to sort of try to put that work in perspective and to see how, notwithstanding all the challenges we're facing, we seem to be able to at least keep up with them, if not always overcome them, at least not right away. So I said that Kairos was formed in 2001, and when it was formed, it brought together 10 social justice coalitions. So these were ecumenical social justice coalitions. In other words, they were church-based social justice coalitions. So in 2001, all of these groups came together into one group called Kairos. So I'll give you an example of the groups that came together. So there was one called the Interchurch Coalition for Africa. And the Interchurch Coalition on Africa sent a delegation to South Africa in 1994, which was part of the initiative that ended the decade-long, that culminated in the decade-long anti-apartheid campaign. And what's interesting is that in 1985, so 9 years earlier, that same Scurr coalition visited Nelson Mandela in prison. And then when the coalition staff tried to enter the country, their visas were denied. So 9 years later, after that first visit, that first denial of the visa, 9 years later, election observers were allowed to go into South Africa from the same coalition, and that culminated in ending the apartheid, or at least contributed to the end of apartheid. And if you remember back before 1985, no one ever thought apartheid would end. No one ever thought that kind of, oppression and domination would be over. And right now it's not perfect, but there was movement there. There was change there. In the 1980s, one of those other 11 coalitions called the Task Force on Corporate Responsibility, or TICR for short, lobby and work on public education and advocacy campaigns to get the Dominion Bank, the Toronto Dominion Bank, to stop loaning money to the apartheid regime in South Africa. So they worked together. These two coalitions strategized, came up with a plan, used public education and advocacy, figured out a way, put pressure on the bank to stop loaning money to the regime. In other words, weakened it enough, brought enough public pressure to bear that they made some change, that made a difference. In 1999, these coalitions got together and worked with other groups, other social justice groups, on something called the Debt Cancellation Campaign. So they were trying to get wealthy nations and banks to forgive their debt to the third world countries. And one of the tactics they used was a petition. And they were able to gather 640,000 signatures on this petition. So imagine that, trying to rally people around third world debt. And imagine the education that had to go on for that purpose. How do people in the first world respond to people who say, we need those institutions to forgive the debt of those third world countries? What do you mean we need to forgive? I have debt, I have to pay back my debt. When I get a loan, I have to pay back my loan. Why should we be treating those people any differently? So there's a lot of education that went into helping people understand the global economic system and how it works and how it's part of the colonization process that we've heard about and how it contributes to oppression and discrimination and so forth. And those were the days when you could actually schedule workshops that lasted 3 or 4 days. Imagine that. Sign up for a workshop, 4-day workshop, where you learn all about this economic model. Remember, this was before Wikipedia, this was before Google. If you wanted to get this information, you had to find people who knew about it and who were willing to take time out of their lives to help you understand it. Forgiving the debt of third world countries was something that even the government of Canada under Paul Martin eventually understood was important, and they succeeded in doing that. These are just a couple of examples of how these very small, I mean we're talking dozens of people in most cases, but persistent groups of people could make a difference and did make a difference. And I think that's where we have to take our inspiration from those who have come before us in the Indigenous and non-Indigenous worlds in all these social justice struggles, help inspire us to continue to work forward. Because together we can make a difference. One of those other coalitions was called the Aboriginal Rights Coalition. And I was actually part of the Aboriginal Rights Coalition when it became part of Kairos. And and just before, and after, not long after, ARC became part of the Kairos, Kairos organized a tour of the Tartan. And I just want to get the dates right here. In 2007, Kairos launched an initiative called the Re-Energized Time for a Carbon Sabbath. So in other words, let's think about what the world would look like if we weren't a carbon-based economy. So trying to get people to think along those lines. And so as part of this initiative and education and advocacy strategy, we organized a delegation of, Southern partners and church leaders to the tar sands. And we spent a few days there learning from the people about the challenges they were facing. In 2009, 2 years later, what this delegation included was a visit from some of those church leaders to the government. It was then the Harper administration. And you had a situation where we were able to meet with representatives from all the parties, in most cases either the leader of the party or senior representatives. But in the case of the Conservative Party, we were met by a junior administrative associate who had a 3-ring binder and used a colored pen to take notes while we were speaking to us. Not long after that, Kairos' international funding was cut. So up until then, Kairos has had a 35-year relationship with the federal government that extended obviously before the time of Kairos. It extended the time of those separate coalitions. 35 years of the government of Canada working with the ecumenical coalitions to provide development assistance to countries around the world. That was cut with one phone call. Some of you may remember the Bam Oda No incident, where all of a sudden the approved application was denied with one little word that said, "This funding is not approved." What did Kairos do? 2 things happened after that. All those partners that now were going to have to change their plans, and most of these partners work on human rights and education initiatives, were having to change their plans because they were no longer going to get this funding from Kairos and the Canadian government. But the second thing that they did after figuring out a way to change their plan was they told Kairos, it's more important to have your support than it is to have that money. Because the money will not last forever, but what we need is your support to build on so that collectively we can reach the goals that we're aspiring to. So that was very significant. The other thing that happened after that was that, people started to act on their own, do whatever they could to support that work. So when Kairos said, because of this government's politically motivated decision, and we still officially don't know why that funding decision was made, but because of this government's politically motivated decision, those partners are no longer able to do the good work that they've been planning to do. People responded in ways that we could never have imagined. And it enabled us to keep those projects going, to keep them on life support, until recently we were able to negotiate a new agreement with the government. So now those projects are getting financial support, and all of them are in conflict zones across the country, working with women's organizations, trying to empower women to be advocates and agents of peace. Because all the studies show that when you engage women in peace negotiations, in those kinds of discussions, you have a better chance of ending conflict and you have a better chance of maintaining a peaceful situation. In all of these examples that I've described, the common denominator is that people have come together under a common cause and common reasons and found ways to work together. And I think that art, at the core of everything that art did, that was the message. We have to find a way to find common ground, to see opportunities in everything that arises, and to work collectively towards that common goal of a world that is free of colonization and the impacts of colonization, a world where Indigenous sovereignty is recognized and celebrated, and where self-determination is not something that people aspire to, but that it's something that people live every day.
Oh. Thank you. I'll just add. I'll add one comment. Kairos paid for one of our Irene and I's trip to Geneva in 2005. So now I'll pass it on to Tara. And after this panel, we're going to take a break, and we're going to do our concluding panel.
Thanks. So, as you said, my name is Tara Scurr, and I traveled up here to Secwepemc territory from Comox territory on Vancouver Island with my children, two of whom are here today. They've been up to these lands many times since they were born, so it's always a joy to come back and to see familiar faces of friends and people we love like family. I first met Arthur about 20 years ago as well, shortly after I came back to Guatemala, where I had been working with a news agency that had been founded in exile by rebel armies in Guatemala that had formed EURNG. And they had formed to sneak news out of Guatemala to tell the story about the genocidal impact of the internal armed conflict on people throughout the country, and who supported the training and development of what they called barefoot journalism. So it was training to have cameras and reporters and to tell stories and sneak them out of the country so people could know the truth about what was happening. And we know from Truth and Reconciliation process and from archives kept during the war that Canadian companies were responsible for or implicated in a number of atrocities that were carried out, displacing people from land, providing equipment for companies to dispose of bodies, or the army to dispose of bodies, and to otherwise carry out attacks against Indigenous land defenders who were trying to stop the desecration of their mountains and their waters for nickel mining, hydroelectric dams, and other projects. So I had just come back from about a year working in Guatemala, and I met Arthur and Nicole and maybe some other people in this room at a conference about water. in Vancouver. So I'm thinking about Arthur a lot during this conference, and feeling emotional, as I'm sure many of you are, and just thinking about how reading art set my feet even more firmly on the path that I've been on. And it's also making me think about all of these sacrificial zones and disposable communities that others talked about earlier that I've seen across Guatemala and here in Canada and other countries as well. And so I think that I'd like to just acknowledge how emotional and draining it is for people who've been up here speaking, who are actually on the front lines every day and thinking about back home every day. And yet they still have the courage to come and speak to all of us. And I just want to acknowledge that and to say thank you. So for the last 15 years, I've been working with Amnesty International Canada, working on corporate accountability issues, mostly in Latin America and mostly in Central America. And then about 5 years ago, began working with around the Mount Poly mine disaster. So when that disaster happened, I got a phone call from our colleagues in the UK who said, "Hey, we just heard about Mount Poly mine disaster in Canada. We'll look into it." And so the first person that I called was Art. And the first person I interviewed was Art to help me set my mind straight as I started to look at this problem and look at what had happened and to figure out the best way forward to understand and to tell the story. And so he also set me on the path of a report that I wrote about the human rights impact of the Mount Poly mine disaster. And we're still following that story and trying to take it to the international level as well, to the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and in other venues as well. But what I guess what I would like to say is the thing that what I've seen throughout this 15 years of work on mining issues are the similarities, the legacy of lies that are told to communities. Farmers living near the Marlin mine in Guatemala were told that their land was being purchased for an orchid farm and that they would have jobs growing flowers. And they didn't know that the top of their sacred mountain would be blasted off and tunnels dug underneath to extract gold and silver. And now they are also living with the legacy of water pollution, health issues, which the company has the arrogance to say it's because people are poor and can't clean themselves. They're living with damaged houses, and they're living with a future where they don't really know what the health impacts will be. It's also like people that we interviewed around Cornell Lake. They say, if I get cancer in 10 years or 20 years, is it because I live beside a mine? You don't know. And so living with that uncertainty inside of you impacts your life in many, many ways that you can't see. And so we know from access to information and other sources that governments will give support to companies and they will continue to promote capitalism over human rights. In the case of the Marlin mine in Guatemala, which I mentioned, that mine is now closed. It was bought up from Goldcorp by a bigger fish. The Inter-American Human Rights Commission received a complaint from 18 Indigenous communities around the mine that said, we're worried about our health, we're worried about our security, we're worried about the impacts on water. And so the commission issued precautionary measures to the country and said, you need to suspend operations at the mine, you need to investigate what is happening, and you need to provide security for the 18 communities around the mine. And so we know from access to information that the Canadian government, the first thing they had received from their cables is they asked, what is Goldcorp's line? What is Goldcorp saying happened? How can we meet with the company? What are they saying? They did not send a delegation to the communities to interview people to find out what human rights abuses they were reporting. Not once, they never sent anyone. They just went to bat time and time again for Goldcorp with the Organization of American States, the Inter-American Human Rights Commission. And we see from their emails, even redacted as they are, we can still see the story. So Amnesty is supporting the Justice and Corporate Accountability Project out of Osgood. law school to file a judicial review seeking more information about what information is being shared with the public and how those decisions came about. In any case, Goldcorp and Canada won, and the suspension order was overturned. The mine continued operating until it shut down quite recently, and people are still, again, left with the same concerns and lack of answers. And last year, we invited a couple of community members from Secwepemc Ktunaxa who've been very, very active, taking enormous risks to speak out against the mine. We invited them to Canada to speak with senators and parliamentarians and the public. And one of the lay sisters with the parish of Secwepemc Ktunaxa, she said, you can provide us with remedy and reparations for some things, but you can't remedy all the damage that's been caused to us by this mine and all the things that we have to worry about in the future. You can't bring back our mountain. You can't bring back our water. So what remedy do you really have for us? And the thing that I've noticed in doing this work, and probably many of you have as well, is when you look into the eyes of the decision makers, the people in power, or the shareholders, you can see that their connections to each other and their connections to the land are broken. They don't understand. When a land defender says, if there is oil under the ground, it should stay there. When they say the river is alive and the earth is our mother, don't understand. And so I see it in some ways through my work at Amnesty, which is a big NGO. We have 8 million members. It's not a grassroots organization. But I see part of our role is trying to, if we can in some way, bridge that gap, bring some light, help to build some understanding, but not at the expense of the people who have to keep telling their stories over and over again, because as I said earlier, we know that's traumatizing. But trying to always make sure that the communities that we work with are at the forefront of telling their story, that we stand behind them or beside them. We provide them with technical support or other things that they need, but they take the leadership. And we never for 1 second take for granted our relationship or any trust that we have in the communities. They have to be the leaders. They know what the problem is. They know what the solutions are, they know what they want, and so that's how, as a large international organization, we must work in partnership or in support. It's not to be out front, it's to be behind, and say, okay, what do you need? Sometimes it's just, I spent about a year just finding money for people to have surgery or to get medicine. So, there are small ways that big organizations like ours can support. And just a couple of weeks ago, the Tiny House Warriors invited a small Amnesty delegation to come and visit. So my children were with me and another youth from the Comox Valley. And we went to visit and to hear what was happening there. And we are extremely worried for the safety of the land and water defenders at the Tiny House Warriors village, for the money that is coming in from formal channels, official channels, to fuel attacks against them. It's despicable, it's disgusting. And within Amnesty, we have a project around toxic social media. And we're, my colleagues in the UK are looking into how we can help support around, the racist and sexist attacks that are playing out on social media against some of the women land defenders who are here. And then also to look at how we can support with physical training, security training, and then also making those links financially. Because what Canada is doing is what Brazil is doing, what Guatemala is doing. We are no better, we're no different. Obviously, we all know that. So trying to make those links and produce some research and some campaigning at the global level to support these human rights defenders who are defending land and water. So, and again, always taking leadership from them, from the front lines. So thank you for letting me explain a little bit about the work that we're doing, and I'll pass it back to Ska-Hiish.
thank you, Eric. That was a good friend of my father. So we're going to take a short break now, and then we're going to have the concluding panel, which is going to consist of Deborah Harry, who's going to call in, Shiri Pasternak, Troy Cochran, who's going to talk to you about economics, works with my dad, and Nicole Chavez and Chris Abernathy, and I decided to join the last panel too, so I can say a few words. Okay, so now we're going to take a 5-minute break. 5 minutes. 5 minutes. 4.5.
We don't need to, I'm going to play music, but that's just going to be for the radio audience.
Okay.
I'm not going through the...
Should all start this, hey?
And you do that, and I'm going to check it with Govinda.
That's what you're talking about?
Yeah!
Simone has this in our budget divided. How much would you... What are they?
So you could barter with the person to make an offering in an exchange and sort of bring back what is the tradition